Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Coastal Waters. The photograph on the right was a reference and inspiration for this painting. I like the cool, distant mountain and some of the purple tones throughout the photograph, as well as a variety of green and gold tones. I find it to be a pleasing composition and didn't see a need to make a lot of changes. This is the sketch that I did for the painting. It's a very simple sketch. I drew the major shapes, gave an indication of where some of the rocks are, and the placement of the trees I indicate with a vertical line. The sketch is done with a B pencil on a quarter sheet of 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. The sketch, the image of the painting, and the reference photo are all available by using the link on the landing page of my online learning center. The colors used for this painting are quinacridone gold, raw sienna, sap green, pyrrole red, quinacridone rose madder, cobalt blue, manganese blue, cerulean blue, and royal blue. I'm going to begin by painting the sky, which has a bit of a pinkish or warm tone towards the horizon. So I'm going to begin with a wash of quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral. And it has quite a bit of water in it, and I'm starting on the horizon there just above the mountain and working up with that warm wash. And then I'm going to take a wash of manganese blue, and I'm going to let that come down the page and then just gradate into the warmer wash, which I applied to start. I'm using a soft 1-inch wash brush. It's a Squirrel synthetic blend. Now I'm going to take a fine mist spray bottle, and I'm going to mist the area that I've already applied the wash. And I'm doing this to give me more of a feeling of clouds, so it creates some lighter areas and soft edges because the paper is still saturated from my initial wash, and then I blot it with a tissue. I'm going to insert the reference photo in the lower left corner as I paint this distant mountain. I'm going to begin by putting a warm wash. If you look close, you'll see that there's some there's some patterns and textures on that mountain shape, and there's some warm tones and there's cool tones. So to start, I'm going to put a warm wash on the overall shape of that distant mountain, and then I'll dry it, and I'm going to come back in. I'm going to do some brushwork on top of this using a cooler mixture. The wash that I'm putting down is using the same colors that I used to accent the skies, quinacridone coral and quinacridone gold. And I'll put just a touch of some cerulean in there to make it just a slight purple tone. So I've dried the warmer wash that I put down. And now I'm coming in with some cobalt blue, and I'm going to paint the cooler patterns that appear on this distant mountain. When something like this is in the distance, it tends to be a little bit less in focus, a little hazier, because you have the atmosphere between you and this mountain. And it also tends to be a bit cooler. As I paint this, I'm using a combination of cobalt blue and a mixture of cobalt blue with quinacridone rose madder and just a touch of raw sienna in it to neutralize it a little bit. So I'm using some kind of blue and purple tones, and then I'm letting some of the initial warm wash come through. Here I'm painting some on the right side of this shape, and most of this shape is going to be covered with those cooler colors. And I'm not just using the tip, I'm also going to take the side of my brush and drag it to give me some broken edges and create some texture, and gives the pattern that suggests the areas of trees and shadows and the different shapes that appear on this distant mountain. And here I'm coming over, and I'm actually into the area that's going to be covered by some trees that are closer to you, but I'm still painting some of this area underneath it in the event that some of that's going to show through the trees. And here I soften it up a little bit with a spray, and I actually got that to travel down a little bit too far. I really don't want it in that area where the wash went. So right there, I want to clean that up. So I'm going to take some masking tape, and I'm going to put that right on that edge that I wanted to preserve. And I'm going to take a magic eraser dipped in water. So you take a sponge, and I'm just going to scrub that and lift that paint off to give me a cleaner edge on the bottom of that mountain. There's actually a shoreline there, and I wanted to maintain that. So when I came in with a spray at that point that I did, it let it flow down the page, and I lost that edge that I wanted to maintain. And here I'm going just a shade darker with this cool tone that I've been using. So just a few touches here and there. I don't want to get too deep with my values and too hard edged, even though it is a fairly hard edge. I want it to feel kind of misty and distant. Now I'm going to begin to paint the tree line, the one that's farthest away, and this overlaps some of the mountain area that I painted. So I'll be working with a variety of colors here. I'll be using some gold tones. I'll be using quinacridone gold. I'll be using some raw sienna. Then I'll be working with sap green with some pyrrole red and some royal blue. I'll be mixing different combinations of these colors as I go along. And at times I'll be working in some greens that are a little warmer and some greens a little cooler. And as I paint these trees, I'm going to point out that when you're looking at the trees, especially in the distance, even though they're individual trees, they start to take on a larger shape than that of one tree. So many trees together start to form larger shapes, while you see the tips of the tree at the top, as they start to come down lower and come together, a lot of times they just merge together into one shape. So I'll be using different combinations of warm and cool to help show that there are some layers to this shape and that there are different trees. But in general, if you look at the value, it's one large shape. And here I'm coming in with a golder tone that has some quinacridone gold with some sap green. And I'm painting the right side of that shape. So I've been a little darker and cooler on the left side, and then I've lightened it up a little bit and warmed it up as I've moved to the right. But I'm going to work in some pockets of darker values and cooler colors on top of this gold tone that I've put down. So you can tell that while it's kind of one large shape, there's some modulation going on that indicates that this is made up of many trees. Now I've dried that mass of trees in the distance, and now I'm taking a mixture of the quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral, and I'm giving the indication of the shoreline there. It has a light tone to it. So just making some brush strokes to give the indication that there's a shoreline there, and I'm not going crazy with detailing and trying to render little rocks in the distance there. I just put in a nice warm tone middle value there just to show that there's a shoreline. I'm going to take some of that same mixture and give an indication more towards the middle ground that there's a shoreline there, and it's just a little bit darker than the one in the distance as this is getting closer. So I'll try to differentiate my values from the foreground, the middle ground, and the background. And I plan to have my darkest values more in the middle or in the foreground in this composition. So this is still the quinacridone gold and quinacridone coral, but now some of these darker values that I'm putting in are more of a mixture of quinacridone rose madder and some just a touch of royal blue in it to give me a little bit of a violet tone. And here I'm putting down some brush marks just to give the indication of the rocky shore. Now I move forward again towards the middle ground, and now I'm going to paint this tree line. So I'm still using the same variety of colors, using some of the quinacridone gold, the raw sienna, using sap green with pyro red and some royal blue. And I'll just mingle these colors on my palette and on the page. And here I'm just using a quill brush here, which has a nice point, holds quite a bit of paint. And I'm just giving an indication of these treetops here in the middle ground. And I started with a warm mixture, and now I'm using a cooler mixture. And I'm just going to alternate a little bit as I go. So here I continue to paint these treetops, and I'm bringing I start with the tops, then I bring it down to a larger wash that just starts to run together with the wash from the other trees. So once again, I start to bring this together as one big shape, but you can make out that on the tops that this is made up of several trees. And here I'm taking that wash from these trees and just bringing it down and filling that space. And I have a mixture that's cooler mixture that has some sap green, pyro red, and some royal blue in it. And then I've added a little bit of a warmer mixture which has sap green with some pyro red, a little quinacridone gold in it. And I'm alternating these warm and cool tones as I start to paint the base of all these trees, and it starts to hang out here on this little point of land that's coming out. As you go up and down these shores, they have lots of little peninsulas, if you will, that stick out, and it creates a nice, interesting layering effect. And I'm going to continue that out to the end of this piece of land that's sticking out. The trees come almost right to the very point by the water. Next, I'm going to take my liner brush, and I'm going to indicate where some of these very narrow tree trunks are. And I'm also going to put some little touches of value here. I'm using cerulean blue. When you look at these trees in the distance, while you see the greens and the golds and a variety of warm and cool greens, there's also just some kind of blue and light violet tones that are juxtaposition right beside some of the green tones here at the tops of the trees. So I'm using that cerulean blue, and I'm just putting some touches of that around with my liner brush. Now I'm starting to move more towards the foreground, and this time I'm going to start to paint some of the tree trunks and linear shapes before I start to paint any foliage. If you recall, in the more in the middle ground and in the distance. I started by painting the foliage first, and then I came over top with some tree trunks and some linear marks. But here I'm starting with the tree trunks, and then I'm going to start to put some foliage on top of these shapes that I'm painting in now. To paint these, I'm using a mixture of quinacridone gold, quinacridone coral, with just a touch of blue, and I'm also using a mixture which has mostly blue in it, with a little bit of cobalt, a little bit of rose madder quinacridone, and some raw sienna in it to neutralize a little bit. So I have a bit of a burnt sienna tone, and I also have some light cool violet shapes in some of these trees. Now I'm going to start painting on top of these tree trunks using some of the same colors that I've been using, the quinacridone gold, the sap green, the pyro red, the royal blue, and I'll just alternate between some of these mixtures that I'm using. Give me tones that are a little golder than some that have more of a green tone, some that are warmer, some that are cooler. And I'm just trying to create some texture here to give the suggestion of these trees. I've inserted the reference photo in the top right corner so you can get an idea of the shapes that I'm painting here. You can see that I'm not approaching this with the mindset that I'm going to render all the little leaves and sticks and everything that I see. I'm painting some shapes here that give the suggestion of these masses of trees, and I'm using a variety of colors. I'm using different brush strokes, and I'm using different brushes as I do this. There I'm moving down and starting to describe what is a flatter surface here. So I'm using the direction of my brush strokes to help give the indication of that piece of land that sticks out, and it kind of flattens out from the trees. And I'm using a mixture now that's leaning more towards the cool side. It's a green, but it has enough royal blue in there that it takes it more towards a cool tone. And I'm going to take a mixture that has a little bit of the quinacridone gold in it and some green. I'm going to fill in the rest of this shape over here on the left side. You can see there's a number of trees here, even it's in the foreground, but I'm handling it as if it's a large shape. And then I'll give it a little bit more detail and make it a little bit more descriptive towards the top with some branches and some brushwork to give the suggestion of trees. And here you can see once again, my brush stroke there, I'm giving the indication that that's just a flat piece of land that's sticking out there. Here I'm going to take a plastic scraper and I'm just going to scrape up a little bit on those two areas just to make it feel like there's some grass or some weeds that are sticking up a little bit. As I had mentioned, now I'm going to be a little bit more descriptive at the top here and give the indication of some of these individual trees by doing some brushwork on top of these tree trunks that I've put here. So I'll be using some of the green and some of the gold tones that I've been using all along. As I paint these, I'm trying to capture some of the spacing of the branches and the direction of the branches with the green, with the greenery that's hanging off of it, just to capture the personality of the different trees. Here I'm taking a mixture that's fairly dark and cool, and it's sap green with pyro red and has quite a bit of royal blue in it. And I'm painting this area that's just behind kind of a bush that's just behind the rocks. And I'm painting it with a darker value to give it a little more depth within this shape, and to create a little bit more volume to that so it's not as flat. So I've darkened that up, and I also want this shape to be darker than the values that I have in the middle ground and the background. I'm not quite sure that I'm there yet. I might come in later and darken this area up still more once I get more of the composition painted, because I want to have enough of a value change between this foreground and the middle ground and background, and they're all pretty close right now. I'm going to take a gold tone here, and I'm going to put it shows just above these darker green areas of the land. It's got some gold there, and then there's some sort of plant life, that floats on the water there and goes off the shore, and it's this gold tone. So I'm gonna take this gold tone out a little bit here to represent that plant life that's floating in the water. And I'm going to put this gold tone in a few places now while I still have the white of the paper before I lose it. That way I get the maximum reflection of light coming through these gold areas. So there's a little bit of it floating in the water here, and then I'm going to take this tone, I'm going to also take it into the shoreline here. So I'm going to paint this band of gold, which kind of is right on the edge of the shore. So it's not a lot, just a touch, and again, I'm painting it now because I get the nice white paper, and I get the maximum reflection of light coming through this gold tone. These heavily wooded areas often have some dead, dried trees laying around or standing. So I'm going to do some lifting to represent some of the tree trunks and represent some of these trees which have died out. So I'm taking clear water on my rigger brush, and I'm putting it on here, and then I'm coming in with a tissue and just striking the paper with a tissue to lift some of that off. So sometimes I'll just take a damp brush and do this, but now I'm actually putting some water on there, and I'm taking my tissue, and you'll start to see some subtle lifting taking place, and you'll see more as I go on. So just clear water. I'm using the rigger brush. So I'm painting these tree trunks and then some dried limbs coming off of it. Now you can see that it stands out more in the darker areas. And then as I progress with the painting, I'll come back with some darker values in a few of these areas and strengthen the contrast around this area that I'm lifting. So here again, I'm putting some clear water down and then just rubbing it with a tissue to lift off some of that paint and give the indication of a tree trunk or a dried out tree. You can start to see those appearing, and I'm going to make some tree trunks, give the indication of some tree trunks here in the distance, more in the middle ground, just by putting a little clear water and then just rubbing it with a tissue. And here, if you look close, you can see that I've created a number of these tree shapes using this lifting technique. Now I'm going to take a dark valued mixture, and I'm going to make some of these tree shapes using the dark value here. So I'm using a combination of shapes where I've lifted and then just coming in and painting some of these dead trees. Now I'm going to start to paint some of the water. And I'm using a combination of cerulean blue and manganese blue. The manganese blue is just a little bit more blue-green, and I'm just using these together, not mixed, but I'm alternating what I'm using just to give a little bit of variety in the color of the water. And these are very narrow brush marks, and I'm given the representation of the blue sky reflecting in some very narrow bands in the distance in this water. And then I'm going to come back and I'll put some of these green tones in between these. That will be the reflection of all the trees and the rocks and everything on the land. And I'm painting these now, just as I did with some of the gold tones, just to get the maximum reflection of light coming through this paint. I didn't want anything to be underneath it. So I'm putting these kind of fresh blue brush marks down that show very well in the distance the reflection of the sky. Now I'm going to apply a wash of cerulean blue, and I'm going to apply it from the bottom and work my way up. I want my darkest mixture to be more towards the bottom in this wash I'm applying. So I'm beginning at the bottom, and I'm going to take some water as I'm going up to thin that out. And because I'm working at an angle, I'm at about a 15 to 20 degree angle, that pigment is going to start to flow down, and it's going to be a little darker towards the bottom than it is the top. I'm going to add a little bit more to it. And the color in the water is a little deeper than the color in the sky. So that's why I'm using the cerulean blue instead of the manganese blue, because it's a little deeper and it's less green, but it gives me the tone that I'm after in that area. So I have a nice even wash there. And I can come back in with my brush because the paper's saturated. Now I'm going to start to paint a little bit more of the shoreline here. So I have a mixture of cobalt blue with some quinacridone rose madder, and then a little bit of raw sienna in it to make it less violet and more neutral, or take away the intensity. And then I have a mixture here which has some royal blue in it, again with some rose madder, quinacridone, and then a little bit of raw sienna, but it's a much darker mixture. So I'm just taking my 1/2 inch flat brush and I'm just painting this shoreline. I'm not trying to get real nitpicky with it. I'm not using a tiny little brush trying to paint little stones. I'm just trying to give a suggestion of that shoreline and some different angles with my brush strokes to give the feeling that that's not just flat there but lifts up a little bit. And then in the distance there, I'm going to again make it feel a little bit more like it's a rocky shore. And probably could go with a little smaller brush there. It's getting a little blocky with a brush mark, so I'm going to get a brush with a sharper point for that distant area there. So the shoreline that I just painted is still fairly damp. I'm going to take a plastic scraper and I'm going to just move the paint around horizontally and vertically just to help give the contour of rocks in the shoreline. You know, there's some angles there and it moves the values around and just gives an interesting effect there that gives a suggestion of a rocky shore. Now I'm going to pick up some of those tones that I have in the rocky shore, and below that little touch of gold, that gold band that I have along the shoreline there, I'm going to place some of the same mixture that I painted that shoreline with, and I'm going to soften it up a little bit with a spray. I'm going to let that flow down just to give the suggestion of being reflected down into the water. And I'm going to blot some of that excess water up here. And while that's still very wet, if the paper's saturated right now, I'm going to drop some other colors into that and let that flow down a little bit. So right now I'm still pretty much picking up the colors that are along the bank of that piece of land, and not so much the trees just yet. And I'm going to get some of that darker value and just put some touches of that into this saturated area and let that flow down. I'm going to take some of that same mixture that I was using in the shoreline in the foreground and put some touches of it there more in the middle ground and just soften a little bit, and I'm going to leave it for now. So now I'm going to take a violet mixture, and I'm going to pick up some of that color from the mountain and the reflection in the water, and I'm going to place that in between some of the blue marks that I put earlier, just to pick up the reflection of the mountain. And I'll bring it to the left over just far enough to where it hits the edge of those trees, and it's going to start to reflect the trees. Then I'll bring a few touches of that purple tone, that violet, a little farther into the foreground there, just picking up in the ripples of the water. So now I want to pick up some of the reflection of the tree, so I'm going to start at the farthest point there with that farthest tree line that comes out on that point. So I'm painting in between the blue that I painted earlier, and I'm using the quinacridone gold, a little bit of quinacridone coral in there, and so it's a wet mixture that I'm putting down. So where I'm putting that gold tone, it's fairly saturated at the moment, and now I'm going to come and I'm going to drop some of these darker greens and browns into this gold that I just placed on the paper. So I want to do that when it's saturated. So just to pick up the reflection of those green tones and the greens and the golds, I started with the gold, and I'm coming back in with a darker value mixture that I'm charging that little area that I put the wash in. So here I'm just putting touches of color in these bands of gold that I put to give the suggestion of the reflection of these trees. Now I'm going to do the same, placing some of that gold tone here amongst the reflection of the rock colors of the rocks that I put in, and I'm going to touch some of that green into that gold and just extending that band of the reflection a little farther to the left. Now I'm going to wet the paper just above where I've put the reflection of the rock. So I have it's mostly clear water. It's lightly tinted with a little bit of pigment from my palette, but I'm saturating this paper above what would be the reflection of the rocks, and I'm going to get it saturated, and then I'm going to come back and I'm going to drop some of those green tones into this wash that I'm putting down to give the suggestion of the reflection of the trees. And as I put this down, I'm trying to carry that edge over to the right just a little bit to give the feeling of the ripples in the water. And now that the paper is saturated, I'm going to drop some of these green tones in here. So it's the same mixtures I've been using all along here with the sap green. And you can see the paper is flowing downwards because as I mentioned, I'm working at an angle. So I have a soft wash brush that I'm putting this in, and I'm using both warm and cool tones just as I have in the actual trees themselves. I'm letting that just flow down to the edge. And I can keep dropping color in here, and I'm not really going to get a blossom because the paper's saturated. I get a lot of mingling of paint and a lot of gradation, but it's not a backwash, and it's not going to give me hard edges. So far I've just been dropping some color into this saturated wash that I have here and letting gravity move the color down the page. But I want to get a little bit more specific on the right side of this area. I want more of a definitive edge on where the reflection of these green trees stops. So I'm taking my brush and I'm giving the indication that there's kind of ripples in the water here, and it just gives a nice edge, and I'm going to take that up a little bit and break the edge of the reflection of the rock also. So I'm using this wash brush that I've been using for the whole process here in this area of reflection, and it gives me enough of a point that I can still give these small linear marks that give the indication of ripples in the water. I want to kind of feather some of that brush activity off here to the side, and I'm going to get a darker value, and I'm going to come in and pick up some of these, giving this the indication that the reflection there is that more the tree in the middle ground there at this point. It's not the group of trees that are in the foreground, but it's still picking up the reflection of those trees that are set back just a little bit. I want to get a little bit of a darker, cooler tone here. And my paper is still very saturated, so I don't have any concerns with still dropping paint in at this point. And next I'm going to take my fine mist spray bottle. I'm going to soften some of these areas, and I'm going to lighten a little bit the reflection up in a few areas, just to give a little bit more dimension to what's going on there. It was a little flat, but I like the light tone coming down after I hit that with a fine mist spray. And now I want to pick up the reflection of those tree trunk shapes that I lifted out earlier. So I'm using the same process here, just taking my rigger brush with some plain water, and I'm putting the mark, the wet mark on the paper, and then just rubbing it with a tissue. I actually kind of strike it as I kind of hit the surface with a tissue, and it lifts out that wet area. I could use a stiff, like nylon brush with a nice edge and just cut into the paint and lift out that way too, but sometimes I like to use this technique, especially when I'm trying to give the indication of some limbs coming off it. It works. I find this works a lot better than just using a flat brush with an edge. It gives me more of the shape that I'm after. Now here, more in the middle ground there, I want to cut through a variety of tones I have. So I am going to use a flat brush here. It's an angled flat brush with a damp, that's just damp, but has a nice edge, and it cuts a pretty good mark out of the paint there and lifts off pretty nice. So I'll use both techniques depending on the result I'm after. I'm I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it. And there you have my painting, Coastal Waters. I hope you enjoyed this. If you want the reference material, you can go to the Online Learning Center landing page, and you'll find a link at the top of the page labeled YouTube reference, and you can find the photograph, the image of the painting, and the sketch there. As always, if you have questions about my materials, you should be able to find the answer by going to the studio page of my website, rsurowitzart.com. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contact@rsurowitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.